Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar on the role of data in the provision of feedback at scale. I'm Alan Song, the facilitator for this webinar and currently serving as part of the Escalite Executive and organizing this series of Escalite webinars this year. Firstly, I'd like to introduce you to the presenter for this afternoon's webinar, Associate Professor Abelardo Pardo from the School of Electrical and Information Engineering, University of Sydney. Abelardo specializes in technology-enhanced learning with emphasis on learning and behavioral analytics, computer support collaborative learning, and personalization of learning experiences. He is the Vice President of the Society for Learning Analytics Research, SOLA in short. In his spare time, he maintains the blog T2T, Techies Meet Teachers, which focuses on issues related to technology when used in learning experiences. Now, for this afternoon's one-hour webinar, Abelardo will share for a segment of the hour, and the remaining time will be open for question and answer session. So without further ado, could you please help me to welcome Abelardo Pardo?
Thank you, Alan, and welcome everyone to this Escalite webinar. I'd like to start first thanking Alan and Escalite for inviting me to this seminar. And the way we're going to structure it, or the way I have in mind for this session, is for me to present perhaps a bit too quickly a few ideas and a few things, and then I think it'll be productive for us to share questions either through audio or through the chat. I'm not sure I will be able to look at the chat while I'm giving the presentation. I'll try to keep an eye on it, but it requires a little bit of handling the windows. So if I don't pay attention to any of those messages, I'll try to catch up then after I finish, okay? Anyway, so today I'd like to talk about mainly three topics. One, very quickly, introduce what we understand by learning analytics. I'm going to assume that the audience is already familiar with the term. And I'd like to put a little bit more emphasis on an aspect of learning analytics that is getting attention, which is this notion of situated actions. The area or the discipline of learning analytics emerged a few years ago already, and it was basically based on the observation that we collect quite a lot of information about how students learn. But I think we are now gravitating towards a more focused approach where we have to identify and study how actions are produced. And these actions are pretty much the focus of the talk. Now, in order to gain a little bit more focus on how to use data to deploy these actions, I chose one element of the learning environment. You could have chosen another one. We could have chosen another one. But we selected feedback for a variety of reasons. First, because it is very important, but also because it helps both technologists and people with educational experience to have a much more clear conversation. So over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, we realized that when we talk about feedback, technologists, they can identify the importance of that feedback and how delicate it is. There is also quite a lot of research literature studying this topic. And there is a very easy connection to be made between data and the provision of this feedback. So that's why I'm going to use it for this talk in order to focus on these actions. So it's like the good example of actions that can be derived from data. And finally, I'm going to provide just a couple of ideas and current initiatives I'm working on. I think the area is very wide, and it has a lot of potential and a lot of initiatives. So it's basically, for me, the objective is to bring to the forefront this type of action-driven type of analysis. Okay, let's start discussing, like I said, very quickly. I'm going to assume that the audience is somewhat familiar with the concept of learning analytics. If we go back, or if we pull the official definition, I think the two most important ingredients I'd like to point out is the notion that the objective of learning analytics is actually based on two concepts. First is gaining understanding on how learning occurs, but also this notion of improvement. And it's important to keep them both there, because depending on the initiative that you see sometimes in the literature or a product or something like that, sometimes the ideas or the solutions put a little bit more emphasis on one, maybe understanding, and not on the other, improving, or the other way around. And I think both of them need to be considered in equal terms. This slide that I'm showing here, what I'm trying to represent is if we keep this focus or this objective on understanding and improving learning, we do have a little bit of a tension, and this is something that has been there from the beginning of the discipline. This tension is between the environment in which learning occurs, and this is represented in the figure by learning design. So the students, the environment, the LMS, the course resources, the pedagogical approach, all those things that surround the overall complex environment in which learning occurs. And then on the other side of the discipline, we have things like algorithms and the representation of information as dashboards and the collection of things like click streams. We're also beginning to realize that we might be able to collect what we call multi-model data sources coming from a variety of places. We could even capture maybe discussions, face-to-face discussions with audio and video. We know that the students in certain experiences, they organize themselves in networks, so we have social network analysis. So basically, the bottom line here is that we seem to have this tension between a very algorithmic technology, or whatever label we want to put on that side, and also the reality of the learning environment or a learning design that captures quite a lot of additional aspects. It has to capture assessment, it has to capture learning outcomes. In some cases, it has to connect with some graduate attributes. And I believe part of the problem, not part of the problem, but part of the dynamic within the area of learning analytics is derived from this tension between the technology on one hand and how aspects of learning and learning designs affect this environment. There was a publication recently that tried to balance a little bit this tension, and implicitly, I believe this publication assumed by Gasevich, Dawson, and Siemens, that was 2 years ago, assumed that there was a bit too much emphasis on the technology, and therefore that's why they came up with this title. Let's not forget, learning analytics are about learning. Just to bring to the forefront that no matter how complex the algorithms, no matter how sophisticated the heuristic to detect the students at risk, we still have to keep the eye on the objective of improving learning or understanding learning. And I think it's worth maintaining that warning, or I think it's worth keeping this comment fresh in our mind. The other thing that I believe we are learning more and more as time advances and this area of learning analytics matures is the component of how learning is situated is very important. And I think whenever I talk to colleagues in meetings or international events or some other gatherings, we always have this conversation saying, oh yes, I tried this solution or that solution, but it was difficult because it was influenced by this or that, or I changed the condition of certain assessment and that changed the way I collected the data, or the data changed because, I don't know. So the bottom line, or for me, the way to understand this type of fragile environment is we don't tend to realize or pay too much attention, but learning is heavily situated. Heavily situated means it is heavily influenced by so many factors out there. It could be the room, it could be the way you present certain resources to students, it could be how much emphasis an instructor plays on one element or another of the design, it could be the relationship among the students, it could be even the physical space. So these are elements that I just lost the slides in front of me. So probably someone clicked on the wrong button and I'm not seeing the slide. Alan, can you restore that slide for me?
Yep.
Oh, there it is. Okay, excellent. So like I was saying, there is this notion of factors that affect so much. What this means is basically that if we try to tackle any learning analytics initiative, the environment is going to have a profound effect. And this is also something that you see that it appears when you read a lot of contribution from different authors in the discipline, which is they describe a scenario or they describe an environment, but if you try to replicate it in a different one, the results, when you try to replicate the results, you have to take into account all these things. And there are some other works out there that say that sometimes analyzing an entire program doesn't make a lot of sense, or you don't get a lot of understanding out of the whole program. But if you peel out a couple of courses from that program, and that those courses have certain structure and require students to participate in a certain way, then is when the data has a much more powerful trajectory when we analyze. I also recently saw a publication in the journal in AJET, the Australian Journal of Educational Technology, which is the journal hosted in ASCALite, but I thought it was very interesting. The title says it all. What if learning analytics were based on learning science? And I believe this is also very timely and connected what I'm trying to discuss here, because basically the paper was saying we have identified, and they actually enumerate and describe 6 areas from learning sciences that would be ideal to tackle with the data. So the way I read this publication is, here is a way for us to identify improvements, potential areas of improvement in our learning experiences, and let's now try to figure out how we connect data to these areas. And as you can see in this slide, the areas are fairly well known: setting goals and monitoring progress. This is very directly connected with self-regulated learning, pedagogical strategies or learning strategies like distributed practice, retrieval practice, prior knowledge for reading, collaborative learning. So these are areas that could be used as another focal point. We could say, let's take, for example, the second one. Can we tackle distributed practice? Do we have data telling us how students address distributed practice? Do they embrace it or not? Can we understand their approach to distributed practice? Can we improve their approach to distributed practice? And this, I think, is a very good way to ensure that the use of data is actually making a difference. It's actually aiming towards that improvement that we saw in the definition. So what I'm trying to do here is something along these lines, but instead of handling regular or generic actions like we see here, what I'm trying to follow is this type of trajectory. So from data that you see now on the left of your screen, we can use the data to gain understanding, but I would like to push it and explore more direct ways of improving the learning environment. And for me, the key item that we have to explore is basically the actions. So let's try to discuss, in terms of actions, what kind of data do I need, or the instructor needs, or the students need, in order to deploy actions, and hopefully these actions are the entity or the element that drives this improvement. This slide that I'm showing here is a little bit of work in progress. I'm trying to capture a little bit the details of a learning analytics model. What you see at the top is supposedly there is a database that receives all sorts of data. And what I've seen so far is that there is quite a lot of still variety and confusion. I lost the slides again. Quite a lot of variety and confusion between the notion of using the data for reporting, using the data for predictions, and using the data for actions. That's this slide. Yeah, using the data for actions. What I mean by that, let me point to it. Where's my pointer? Here's my pointer. What I mean is these 4 boxes you see here in the slides, I'm pointing to them. Analyzing the data that we are capturing is fairly intuitive. Reporting it is also fairly intuitive, because sometimes we understand that we are reporting back to instructors, and perhaps dashboards would fall into this box. Prediction is a bit more complex, because we need to use previous data to create a model, and usually that model goes through a reporting phase. So the instructor receives some estimates of how the students are going to perform. The connection that I'm finding a bit more difficult is this connection with actions. In other words, after we generate this knowledge that is reported either to instructors or students, there is this connection between instructors and students and the action. So I'd like to focus a bit more here. How can we drive a more intense activity with respect to actions, so that we then get closer to explore or guarantee that we are going to create an improvement on the learning environment? And this is the reason why we chose to focus on feedback. Like I mentioned before, there are quite a lot of intuitive reasons for what feedback is a very good conversation started. If you look at the studies of feedback, there is plenty of literature out there and plenty of people that did very thorough analysis. One of my favorites is this study or meta-study that John Hattie from the University of Melbourne presented a few years back. Sometimes with instructors, they face the question of saying, all right, I am about to deploy a learning environment, a learning experience. It's a very complex system. I perceive that there are so many effects that I could touch or tweak or address or change, so many strategies, so many parameters, that you feel a little bit overwhelmed. Instructors feel overwhelmed. And the question is, what would I change one or two effects or one or two variables that I would change that would create an effect. And that's precisely the result in this study. They tried to estimate the amount of positive change that is derived when instructors address or change the following factors you see here. So the first one is providing formative evaluation, comprehensive intervention for learning disabled students, reciprocal teaching, feedback, space versus mass practice. So what you can see here is that feedback, even though it appears in number 4, could be also related to number 1, because formative evaluation could be considered also as formative feedback. So as you can see, feedback it's one of the factors that has the potential to create quite a lot of positive improvements. So that's why we decided to focus on this aspect. If you look at the definition of feedback, it's very interesting because it has been evolving over years. At the beginning, it was just considered simple information that you give the students. But a little bit later, the experts realized that it's not only about providing information. That information is part of a process. I like the word process on this definition included in this book published by Bode and Molloy about 3-4 years ago. Understanding feedback as a process, I think, is a much more powerful analogy. And it's a process that is described in terms of what the students should do with the feedback rather than what instructors are supposed to. And I believe it's a very good definition because, oops, somebody's clicking in the wrong place. Can I please? Okay, yeah. So like I said, this definition, it brings the focus on the students and what they have to do, such as the process is successful. Another interesting contribution that helped me understand what are we talking about here is this taxonomy or characterization of feedback levels that was also proposed by Hadi and Timperlake. This is 2007. And what they identify in their model is that they could develop or they could separate feedback into 4 categories. First, at the level of task level, and think of this first level as simply telling students if something is correct or incorrect. At the level of performance, perhaps you gain a point or you lose a point. But there were these other 2 next levels that were more powerful. The second one is at the level of process, reasoning about what you need to understand and the steps you need to perform in order to improve. And that's a much more powerful level. The third one is at the level of self-regulation, which is basically detecting what kind of strategies are being used by the students and directing them to make a much more efficient effort. And the final one is addressing feedback at the personal evaluation level. Now, the main result that I thought it was very interesting from this publication was that out of these 4 levels, they claimed and they proved that these level 2 and level 3 are the most effective ones to improve the student experience. Level 4 is very delicate in the sense that you can even achieve the opposite effect. If you provide very personal feedback, it could even be detrimental to the students. And the first one, task level, had a very reduced effect. And this is a little bit the kind of intuition we have when we focus or we address an instruction opportunity. And if we just provide students with basic task level notion of what is right and wrong, and we don't elaborate about that, if we don't go in levels 2 or 3, we also get the sense that that feedback is not as effective as possible. And the other thing underlying the whole concept of feedback, and there's plenty of literature elaborating about that, is that it's very time consuming. So this is a little bit of a difficult situation. The next slide shows a bit of a model trying to capture this double iteration, one that occurs internally in the mind of the student, setting goals, selecting strategies and tactics, deploying some sort of steps to internal feedback. There is a component of self-regulation. And then we have the external feedback when the mental process crystallizes in some sort of observable outcome that then is referred to maybe a teacher, a peer, or someone else, and it provides information that is going to probably affect the domain of knowledge, the strategy, the motivations, the beliefs. So these are the 2 internal and external feedback that gives this notion of a process. This model was proposed by Nicola and Mark Farley in 2006. And from this model, they even proposed 7 guidelines to provide good feedback. So again, these are elements that if we keep them in mind from the point of view of data, would be extremely useful for us to start guiding our data analysis towards specific actions in these elements, for example, in these suggestions. So encourage teacher and peer dialogue. What kind of dialogue can we have based on data? Deliver high quality feedback information. What do we mean by high quality feedback? How do I provide high quality feedback based on the data that I'm collecting? Is the data that I'm collecting helping the instructor, the expert, to provide this quality feedback information? Am I facilitating self-assessment for the students or not? So as you can see, these are questions that rather than pushing them all the way directly to an algorithm, it needs the interpretation of a human. And I think this is also a very interesting concept, because this other publication that I refer here, 2016, Ryan Baker published a very interesting paper discussing precisely this. The title says it all: the stupid tutoring system, intelligent humans. And the main idea that is explored in that paper is to change a little bit the focus, and instead of trying to aim at completely automated artificial intelligence solutions to the learning problem, perhaps what we need is intelligence amplification. Perhaps what we need is the algorithms and the knowledge that we discover to support then instructors and students on their own decision-making procedures. And this makes much more sense. And if we go to the previous slide again, if you think of algorithms, rather than replacing the provision of feedback with these seven guidelines, instead of that, why don't you think of technology supporting the instructors to see if they can encourage teacher and peer dialogue or deliver high quality feedback information? In other words, to the question that I posed before, what kind of data do I need to provide high quality feedback information? You need an instructor, you need the expert, you need that type of situated knowledge that the instructors have about the learning design to then drive the type of data and the type of analysis. So what I'm claiming here is that it is a very promising area to maintain the instructor in the loop, to maintain even the students as well in the loop, to ask them what they think about the data we are providing them, to receive feedback from them about what kind of strategies are working more effectively or not. And these are basically the two examples that I wanted to briefly mention here. How do we try to drive the data analysis and how to drive the context of learning analytics to have in mind some sort of action that is specifically targeting something that is interesting both for the instructors and for the students? So in this slide, what I'm trying to capture is just a simple initial assumption, which is, let's suppose that students are interacting with tutors, they are interacting with resources, and they are interacting among themselves. And let's assume that technology allows us to observe that type of interaction. I know that there is a potentially huge variation between what I can track, what we can observe or not. But let's assume that we have some level of observation of what the students are doing in an environment. And here you could think of things like I am able to observe if they engage with certain video resources or formative assessment opportunities or summative assessment opportunities or things of that sort. So the first work that we did in this space, and I wanted to run by you just as an example, is this idea of detecting student learning strategies. So to tell you in advance what we are after is we envision instructors being able to talk to the students and elaborate or discuss or suggest different learning strategies. But in order to do that, it's much better, rather than let's say, for example, an instructor publishing a post in a forum saying these are the ideal learning strategies we have identified. Rather than do something like that, we can do right now in any environment. What we are after is a much more personalized communication. In other words, if we have a large number of students, what we would like to do is to talk to each student individually, or rather ideally, but rather send each student individually a personalized suggestion about how they should go about on their learning strategies. That's the objective. Oops, please stop clicking on the slides. Thank you. All right, so if we go back to these pictures that you have in front of you, what we are trying to achieve is, if we want to talk to students about their learning strategies, the first thing we have to do is being able to detect them and differentiate them. Now, what you're looking at there now is a visual representation of the different learning strategies of 4 clusters of students. And these clusters have been produced by an algorithm. And in here is the type of communication that I was referring to before between the type of data that I'd like and the type of actions that I'm going to deploy. As you can see, these 4 representations are very different. In the horizontal axis, what you have are days. So these are like the 90 days that are usually part of a semester. This is a 10 or 12 week semester course. So again, in the horizontal axis, you have time. In the vertical ones, what you have is the percentage of resources of different types that they use. So different color means a different type of resource. Red one means video. The one at the bottom, it's kind of like bluish or greenish, is reading. Orange is correct formative assessment. Green is incorrect formative assessment. So if you take a vertical slice of one of these graphs, what you have is the percentage of resources that the students are using at a certain point in time. Now, what we did is we selected this type of data because what we were after is trying to find out if students use different strategies with the variety of resources that are available out there. And as you can see, the answer is very interesting. Like top right graph over here, as we can see, these students, they barely have any interactions with these resources at the top. As the semester go by, they usually use only 2 of them. Whereas the one at the top on the left, we see that it's quite a lot of variety. These students devote quite a lot of time in pretty much all the resources. If we go to the bottom right corner, we have a much less activity in these resources and a lack of activity. This gray area over here is lack of activity, which means that these students are engaging just with a few resources with a small amount of time. And in here, if we go to the bottom left, what we see is that most of the engagement here is reading. This color over here represents reading. And this is what put us in the track to make this connection. So all of a sudden, what I'm after is try to go back to the students and tell them something about their learning strategies. If I am an instructor, how would I start that conversation? I would probably first ask the student, so tell me how do you approach learning in this learning experience? Tell me, how do you go about with all these resources? Which ones do you use? Which ones do you like the most? So these that you're looking at here is the approximation to that conversation, but provided automatically by an algorithm. So the algorithm comes back and says, oops, all the sessions that we have detected in your course, they can be grouped in these 4 clusters. Now remember, this is just a categorization. It doesn't mean that every student is represented here. What we are representing is clusters of students. And this is perhaps the most important connection. What we are deriving from here is the fact that if I am able to detect these clusters, then I can envision an instructor talking to those students that are in this cluster. And perhaps the conversation would go along the lines, I know you are using resources of type A and B or B and C. You should probably consider playing around or including in your learning session or your study session these other resources. And if we put the instructor in the driver's seat when creating this type of conversation or messages, the instructor will very likely be capable of not only saying, I would recommend you to use these resources, but the instructor could mention the specific objectives, the specific topics, the specific steps that are required to use these resources in the context of the course. In other words, it could situate that conversation much better. So this is one example that I thought it would be good to cover here because it's explaining or is illustrating how to bring this middle point between the separation of data and the need of actions in the learning environment. Let me give you another couple of examples. So the next one is the typical use of a dashboard, right? As we saw in the model before, ideally these actions that you try to include to improve the learning environment, some of them, if not most of them, should include the students. The students should be aware or should be informed or should have the knowledge to help them make decisions. And this is an experiment we ran like a couple of years ago in which we gave the students a dashboard. And with the dashboard, what we were pretending is for them to reflect on what is happening and perhaps make some decisions about it. But one thing we realized is that providing the dashboard was not part of a effective measure. In other words, even though we tell the students, look at your results here, when we ask them about what kind of feedback did you receive in the course, and this is representing the satisfaction on the unit of study evaluation. When we ask them, were you satisfied with the assessment or feedback in the course, we didn't detect any significant change. The two representations you see here is the 2013 edition, no dashboard present, and 2014 edition, in which we introduced the dashboard. So this is telling us that even though from the data perspective, we perceive a dashboard like something really powerful because it represents something that is happening for every student. I forgot to mention, but this dashboard is personalized. It's for every student. They connect and see their own data, and it's updated in real time. So even though we offer them this, the effect is almost nothing. They still don't perceive a significant effect. And this is what got us thinking and reflect a bit more and begin to identify not only a visual interpretation, we need to have this notion of a conversation between the instructor and the student. So this was the next idea we tried. We used algorithms to group the students in these 4 categories, and these 4 categories were low level of engagement, modest level of engagement, a little bit higher level of engagement, and very high level of engagement of the students. And we worked with a fairly large cohort, and the data was coming and classified immediately into quartiles. So from the instructor point of view, you should talk to the audience that had barely any interaction with this activity, the action that had mild interaction with this activity, the students that have a decent interaction, and very high one. So this is what we end up doing. We end up exploring how to write messages that are highly situated. It's not something that says, it's not a message that says you haven't been engaging with the resources. No, no, no. It's a message that is specific for a task. So the instructor is in a position to write some specific feedback that is very situated, and it is addressing a concern in the context of that task. And this is repeated for the other ones. This is for the next category, in which there has been a little bit of interaction, but perhaps not as much as desirable. Number 3 and number 4 is basically along the same lines. Is saying, okay, there's been some interaction. Would you be able to make some other connections or some recommendation perhaps for the high-performing students? Say, okay, you probably need to give it a quick review because we just realized that there is a lot of practice going on here, and you understand this concept. What we did with these comments, though, as you can see, they are highly situated. They are very difficult to create automatically by a machine because it has a lot of information about the context of this task in the design. And at no point we are saying, we know you haven't engaged with the activity, or we know you have engaged a lot with the activity. We go straight to providing them with suggestions to improve their strategy. And that's pretty much the effect here. What we did the next step is just to combine these type of messages, but we combine them for more than one task. So when we ask students during a certain week to work in 2 or 3 tasks, at the end of the week, they receive a personalized email that is composed by these blurbs, and each one of them is written by a human based on the level of engagement with these activities. So the final product out of this is a personalized email that looks something like this. And we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 activities, 5 different messages that have been personalized based on the indicators of engagement for this student. And this is all text written by a human in the context of this activity, in the context of the overall course. And that's why we have very specific suggestions here about how to do it, or in some cases, even suggestions on how to do extra work or extra communication or extra studies. And like I said, this email is then automatically sent to a large number of students. So this is our way of trying to tackle what I mentioned in the title of the talk, large student cohorts, or providing feedback at scale. It is not the type of feedback that is similar to a whole conversation with a student, but it's an initial approach or an initial approximation that technology right now makes it feasible and provides a way of combining this expertise of the instructor with the possibility of talking or sending this email to a large number of students. Now, after we did that, this is the comparison of the answer to that feedback question We bring 2015, which is the bar at the right of each group, the blue one. And once we deploy this feedback, it was done only for 4 weeks out of a 12-week semester. Then when we asked them about the feedback in this unit of study or the course student survey, we saw a very significant jump on the average of this satisfaction. And in fact, the effect size is almost 0.5. It's a medium to positive effect. So this is something very rewarding, or at least is telling us that this is the type of feedback that students perceive as valuable. Now, the other question, of course, that you're thinking is, okay, so students seem to have appreciated those messages, but did it have any effect on the academic performance? And we measured that right after those 4 or 5 weeks of emails. We had a midterm in this course. This was around 200 and something students, and we did detect an increase, although a small positive effect. In this case, the effect size is 0.2, which, if you read a little bit the literature, is usually the type of good effect size you have in initiatives that are considered to have a good effect. So 0.2 is a good result. It's not a earth-shattering result. It's not that the students all of a sudden became much better. But I think it is coherent with other initiatives and with other techniques that are reported in the literature. So after these initial results, which some of them we're still preparing to publish them in journals, what we decided is to get a bit more formal and take a step back and say, okay, what if the instructors have access to these detailed matrices in which we have a collection of indicators that are updated regularly, and they can reason in very simple terms, with a very simple technique. If they can reason about what can I tell the students based on these indicators. And again, some people may say these indicators are not exactly capturing what is happening, and it's probably true. But at least these indicators might give you an approximation that an instructor could use to start a conversation. And this is when this project was born. It's a project that we have currently going. It is also derived from a tool that was initially developed at the University of Sydney called SRAS by Adam Richman and Danny Liu. And it was basically a way of sending the students these personalized messages that you see here, using rules like if this, then that. If something happened and some condition is true, then I'm going to include certain tips or certain suggestions. And what we are doing in this project is try to take a more generic view and see if we are able to provide the instructor with a web interface that, if given data from a variety of sources, these instructors should be able to write these personalized rules, or these rules to include personalized content that is then provided to the students, much in the spirit of what I described in the previous prototype, which was something that we played with in the years before we started the project. So this is a little bit more of the representation of what we are after. If there is a rule that says if video 3.9.5 has not been watched, and we are assuming that we have such an indicator, then and we could include here one of these sentences, which is not the case, but we could say, oh, watch the video in activity 3.9.5. It explains how arrays, tables are stored in memory, blah, blah, blah. So this is a reason that the instructor can include in order to convince the student that having watched that video why such thing is important. And replicating these rules will allow you to create this type of personalized text. Now, this personalized text that you're seeing here, we are exploring two options, an option of sending them through email, or an option of pushing these as an HTML page on the learning management system so that students can go there and look at their learning strategy or suggestions or whatever you want to call it. The project started last year, and we're going slowly but surely, deploying the initial pilots right now within the consortium. We have 3 or 4 institutions that are ramping up with the initial version, and we try to see the issues of having the instructions writing the rules, what kind of support do we need, the issues of data access is fairly complex. We just had a tutorial in the LAC 2017, which was like a month ago in Vancouver, and we wanted to touch base with the experts and get their feedback about if this tool makes sense, if this is solving a problem, if this is something that the professionals out there see the potential for it, if people are convinced that they can make a difference for the students. And these are the type of conversations we have there in LAC. If any of you is interested on participating or start playing with the tool, what we're doing now is collecting a list of people that have expressed this interest, and we plan to release this tool as open source, as well as some information about the pilots. And it would be, this list would be our vehicle to then contact you and say, you remember that type of thing we described? Here you have the code. Here you have a few guides and suggestions that we extracted from these pilots. We also plan to include in that project a bit of information on how to navigate the institutional structure so that this tool makes sense at the enterprise level, not only at a single course type of application. So this information is now on the making, but we rely a lot on the distributed intelligence of the community practice. So from here, I want to invite you, if you want to, just contact us, and we'll keep your email and notify you whenever we make this progress, which will be in the next coming months. All right, let me conclude, and then we have probably enough time for questions. Just repeating or emphasizing perhaps the three important points that I wanted to bring about in the talk. We need to remember that the data we are usually talking about so much in the context of a learning experience, it has to be used to understand and improve the learning. And when we talk about understanding and improving, there are so many variables, and it's so heavily situated that we need to make our best to make sure we connect it to actions. Make sure we provide a solution that goes all the way. Perhaps stopping at the level of a dashboard or a very comprehensive report is acceptable for certain situations, but in most cases we need to go beyond that and also explore what kind of actions, situating what kind of environment would be ideal. Like you saw in this talk, we use the concept of feedback as just one entity for us to explore these actions. And over the course of the last couple of years or so, what we realized is that feedback is a very good conversation starter. Instructors understand what is feedback. Instructors immediately identify how complex it is. There is a lot of literature suggesting on the best ideas and the best ways of providing feedback. Not only that, it's also a very challenging problem, because if you want to scale it, you have to start considering peer feedback as well. But peer feedback is also difficult. You have to motivate students to provide feedback. Students learn much more from the fact that they are providing feedback rather than reading the feedback that is given to them by other peers. But these are all very interesting issues that have a lot of potential to be connected with data sources and with providing instructors with the power of improving that process. And then I think another very important point is we need to explore the design of these ideas or these initiatives or the use of analytics tool from the point of learning theory. Learning theory gives you a very good beacon, if you will, or a very good reference point. And like I said on a previous slide, if you identify 5 or 6 areas that learning sciences have already studied as creating potential improvements, then it's a very good way to start to look at how data can then enhance or guarantee that the improvements are much more substantial. Okay, I think I'm gonna leave it here. That concludes the slides that I have prepared. So I think it's now time for me to review the chat, which I've seen that is being beeping in the background, but I didn't have time to read the messages. I'm going to go quickly through them. And if you have any other questions, I don't know, Alan, if you want to open the floor in audio or in text. Back to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Abelardo, for the insightful presentation, and sharing is really helpful. Yes, I think now is time for us to have any questions that you have. You could either type it in the chat box, or you can even use the audio setting as well by just clicking on to the microphone button and speak, and after which you can disable that as well at the same time. So, oh yes, we have a question here from Logan. Yeah, if I may just read it. Was there any correlation between cluster of learning strategies and student performance or satisfaction?
Yes, that's a very good question. It's actually another of the results of that paper. That's the next thing we studied, is that correlation. Yeah, there was a correlation both in the midterm and the final exam. More than correlation, what I would say is that the average scores of the students in those clusters were statistically significant. And if you run this type of analysis, what it could happen, and this is something that happened to us in some other contexts that we've been studying, is that even though the algorithm, the clustering algorithm, correctly classifies the students into, let's say, in this case was 4, but it could be 5 or 6, depends on the data you have, because the algorithm follows the heuristic that has internally. You still might see that from the point of view of increase on academic performance, some of those clusters do not have statistically significant differences. Even though they are different in appearance from the point of view of engagement, they do not have statistically significant differences. In our case, we did detect 3 of these significant differences. And ultimately, that's also what will shape the way the instructors might contact students and have that type of conversation. Another comment that I wanted to make, or to squeeze in while we're discussing this, some of you have been taking notes about the slides and the references. Dan Lawrence, like 3 or 4 minutes ago, thank you, Dan, published the link of the slides in SlideShare. So as you can see, the slides have the Creative Commons license here. I uploaded it to slideshare.net. If you search for my name there, you'll see that the first presentation are these slides, and the slides contain all the references. The other question about how do we sign up for the trial on task. What we have now is a set of pilots that are running, and we are supporting, and we are kind of like with our plate full. We plan to use these pilots to polish the tool a little bit more and then release it towards the end of the year, ideally towards November. What we will do is make an announcement. If you drop us an email, we'll keep your reference, and then we'll contact you back in October or November by the time the tool is ready to install and run your own prototypes or your own pilots. Nancy Gleason has a very interesting one. How do I understand the role of artificial intelligence in algorithm-based feedback assessment in a small class setting? Small class settings, to be entirely honest, is something a bit of a difficult because you typically have, assuming that you have a very good instructor, you typically have a human already in the process that has a very good intuition and knows the students very well. So I would say that small class settings are the ones that have less potential for artificial intelligence and automation to get in there. It's a matter of what kind of tasks and what kind of processes do you have in mind. But usually with a small number of students comes a very good knowledge from the point of view of the instructor. So the instructor ends up knowing the students, the environment, the resources, the interaction. So yeah, artificial intelligence in there might be some potential, but it's probably not the first place I would look in order to search for improvements. Another good question from Dan Lawrence: is OnTask compatible with any particular LMS or SIS? One of the things that also we learned over the years is that when trying to address a problem with technology in a learning environment, if you are not careful enough, then you start trying to solve too much. There is actually a theorem out there, one of these theorems or laws, funny laws on the internet, that says any educational technology tool over a certain amount of period of time will have so much functionality that will become an LMS. You'll try to become an LMS. With OnTask, we try to follow the opposite. We are going to assume in OnTask that data is available. And I know this is a very controversial point, and I know most of you in institutions will think, yeah, data is available, but in fact it is not, or it won't be in the shape and form that might be useful for this system. And that's probably true. Having said that, though, what we are also detecting in the community of instructors is that some of them, they're already using information sources that are useful for them to take actions. We have seen some other pilot in UTS in which the instructor was using e-textbook platform. And that textbook platform was getting this person quite a lot of information about the type of resources and activities the students were doing. And this person felt that with that information, he was in a position to write some specific emails for the students, and the students reacted very positively to that. So the data availability or the data compatibility, it's still an issue. It's an issue that if we wait for it to be solved, these tools will not see the light ever. So we decided to adopt this different approach. We assume that data will be more or less available in one shape or form, and it will change significantly from institution to institution. but at least we have a tool that represents the potential for the benefit or for the improvement of the experiences, and perhaps seeing that improvement or seeing that potential in a bit more explicit way will push vendors and institutions to address the issue of data compatibility or data availability in a much more serious way. The question from Logan, is there a minimum amount of student interaction data we need to capture for this strategy? This is a very good question, but it's again highly situated. I would push that question to the expert. In other words, if you have a person that says, yeah, I have a large set of student cohorts, I detect a couple or 2 or 3 things that I like to address in a personalized way, this person might be in the best position to tell you exactly how much information he or she needs to send those emails. Let me give you an example. Suppose, and this is the type of experiences we are running with one of the pilots in University of South Australia. We have this course coordinator that wants to send these personalized emails before the census date. And the type of information is attendance to certain sessions and visiting the course page and submitting 2 or 3 assessments, right? So implicitly in that rule, that person is telling you the amount of information that is needed for that intervention to make sense. She needs these 2-3 weeks worth of data. And those 2-3 weeks worth of data is because the type of communication will be around that type of environment. So you're not going to go back to the students and tell them you're not studying enough. It's more like, have you make sure you check these resources? Is there any problem we can help you with for attending the tutorials? This type of thing. So the data needed for an intervention will be identified and decided by the instructor. Jenny mentions about the effect size of the intervention. I agree. Anything below 0.4 is not a strong intervention. In our case, the intervention was a small to medium, not a strong one. A strong one, yeah, you're right, 0.4. We still, though, detected that increase in academic performance, and when we paired it with student satisfaction on the feedback, we thought it was something that at least created an improvement and proved the point that there is an effect of these comments. But you're right, it's not a strong. It didn't have a strong effect on the academic performance. It did have a strong effect on the perception. Strategies to increase that effect size are tricky, and it usually requires a much more comprehensive approach. So just sending students some emails will address certain limitations, but not the ones that will get you to a 0.4 effect size. You probably have to do more of a comprehensive set of actions and deploy other things like perhaps more personalized tutoring sessions or different type of resources. Difficult to say. One thing, though, that is pointed out by the results, which I think is interesting, is this truly personalized concept. So each student receives the email that is addressing the issues that are relevant. So rather than posting some generic suggestion in the forum, which every instructor at some point did anyway, right? I strongly suggest you review these videos, or I strongly suggest you solve problems, or I strongly suggest you review this document. What happens with those type of channels, it has 2 effects. First, the students pick up very quickly if it is relevant for them or not. But the most important one is if it is not relevant for them, they end up reducing their perception of usefulness for that channel. In other words, by the time you have the 3rd post in the forum saying, please read this document that is relevant, students are beginning to perceive that that channel is not offering them information that is relevant as much as they would like. For learning analytics, yes, the ethics clearance is very important, especially if you go to things like focus groups and interviews, absolutely. And the pilots we're running right now, we have ethics clearance to then ask the students about how effective were these messages, did you find them useful or not? And we also have ethics clearance to ask the tutors and the instructors, was this something useful or not? Do you think this technology can help you in the future or not? So these type of studies, and the tutorial that we mentioned in Vancouver, which we run these questions through that audience, before running those questions, we circulated the participant information form and the participant consent form that they have to sign and agree for them to participate in that session. So yeah, definitely all these type of studies, whenever you have these type of procedures, you have to have the right ethics clearance. Absolutely.
Okay, we have another 5 more minutes. If there's any question, you can please feel free to pose. Yeah. Okay, I think if you have no other question, we shall end the session here. But before we end, we just want to thank Abelardo on behalf of Escalite and everyone attending this particular webinar. Thank you so much for the session. And we hope that you have found this session useful, and we will keep you informed about the webinars scheduled in the coming weeks, and hope to see you at the next one then. So bye for now.